and you were a startup in Silicon Valley, you didn't really have a lot of, you couldn't offer secure employment because you're starting up, so what you would offer was stock options. And so that increasingly is the model of compensation for executives in the pharmaceutical sector. And of the top 5, I'd say, top 5 pharmaceutical executives, the stock-based executive pay constitutes over 95% of their salary. So the incentives there are to jack up drug prices so you can jack up your stock prices. They are not, they engage not in R&D, they'll buy other companies, but they're not engaging in a lot of R&D in-house. And what they're doing is buying back their own stock. They're engaging in stock buybacks to keep the prices high. So they're creating scarcity to keep the value high, which is their incentive because 95% of their salary comes from this activity. And so other factors or other things to think about are, besides maximizing shareholder value, you also tend to get a lot of regulatory mismatch. And we see regulatory mismatch between innovation on one hand and patient safety on the other. We've seen this a lot in the area of medical devices. And not surprisingly, a lot of it has to do with women's reproductive health, starting with the Delcon Shield scandal in the 1970s, and moving on now to morcellation for laparoscopic surgery. So laparoscopic surgery is less invasive, and they put in a little tiny needle or whatever and do the job. Well, it was for orthopedics, but now they're starting to use it for uterine fibroids. And then when they use that, they didn't realize if there happened to be cancer cells in there that they didn't know about, it actually rapidly spreads the cancer. So that's a case where there's now some pushback about regulating medical devices, but the wanting to get it on the market quickly, the regulatory framework in the United States with the FDA has moved much more to innovation and leaving patient safety aside. So this big structural thing is having really profound effects on the ground in a lot of different instances. Another interesting thing that's happening, and it was mentioned yesterday about the competition between the United States and China. China has become the biggest patent country in the world, the most patents, biggest patent office in the world, the most litigious in terms of patents. They're copying all the bad habits from the West, and they're putting them on steroids in terms of ownership of intangibles and patenting. And so this is a national level competition between the US and China to capture global rents. And it's leading through the internationalization of intellectual property. But as we know, too much intellectual property raises the cost of innovation. And we see the IP is getting an IP portfolio strategy is driving a lot of biotechs because you want to have something that you can tell your venture capitalists that you're worth investing in, and IP portfolio is an important part of that. But a lot of this is leading to things like blocking patents or patent trolls, as Jomo was mentioning, sleeping patents, which are rampant in high-tech area in particular. So that's, and also acquiring startups to forestall future rivals, so to keep a damper on competition. And that helps keep your share price high as well. So investors are really looking for quick returns, and so we end up with a lot of things like Me Too drugs. There's, I don't know how many erectile dysfunction drugs are on the market when we don't have drugs for most tropical diseases. It's drugs rich people can pay for, and there's this big neglect of tropical medicine in particular. Help with competition and prices, but mergers and acquisition dramatically as innovative pharma companies are out of their pipelines are drying up, their blockbuster drugs are coming off patent, so they're buying generic firms. And in 2016, 34.9% of all mergers and acquisitions in the pharmaceutical sector were generics and generics. So don't expect low prices for very much longer. what I want to say now are some of the other, not implications, but things to think about as a way forward, because it's sort of a depressing story. First of all, as Maria Mazzucato has made an argument, as well as William Lozanic, she's got a book called The Entrepreneurial State, and writes about how you had mentioned, the U.S. government invested in nanotech and invested in the internet, all sorts of things. So thinking about the state, yesterday we kept talking about the state as sort of a passive actor in these spaces. It actually wasn't that passive, and it created a lot of innovation, especially in the United States. So government spends a lot of money on life sciences research. Pharma certainly benefited from this. Between 1996 and 2004 alone, the NIH budget, the National Institutes of Health budget, doubled. So the government also provides patent privileges for pharmaceutical drugs, but governments invested a lot in science and engineering, and households invest in science and engineering, educating that labor force. So you have to think about, and Lozanic makes this argument, who's creating value? Who's creating the value and who's extracting it? And they would argue that, Lozanic and Mazzucato would argue that there's a predatory value extraction going on in the financialized capitalism, where there's a big mismatch between those who are creating the value and those who are extracting the value. And so the government also plays an important role in procurement. That's a huge role that they play in the medical space in particular. They play a very, very big role. So things to think about are how to realign value capture with actual value creators and those who are investing, which are states, which are households, in educating this labor force. And it shouldn't all be the winner take all, and the winner take all happens to be the owners of intangibles. And it's leading to really dramatic spikes in inequality and concentrations of wealth. There's also a lot of discussion and experiments going on with alternative funding mechanisms for health, including patent pools and also prize funds. The notion of prize funds, where you would be rewarded for an innovation that had an impact on the most number of people. So that would incentivize people to address things like tropical diseases that are not super profitable under the existing system. So there are a lot of interesting alternative funding mechanisms being discussed, because they're realizing the dysfunction of this 21st century capitalism. And the last thing I want to mention is just a plug. I'm very excited. I was co-editor with Owen Williams from University of Queensland of a new issue, of special issue of Review of International Political Economy on the global political economy of health. And there's a lot of really interesting essays in there that I can brag about, because I didn't write them. I just co-authored the initial piece, but it's a very exciting journal issue, and I'd urge you to check it out. It's all the publications are online now. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll just try to give, in responding to some of the comments made both today and a bit yesterday, just give it a bit of a country context, and probably use some of the lessons from South Africa and some of the observations. Maybe for the benefit of the colleagues who might not be too familiar with South Africa, is that it's the most unequal society in the world. We have that dubious honor now. We used to be very close to Brazil, but I think we've really mastered the art of outstripping everybody on inequality. And if you go to my country, you'll find essentially, classically, people call it two worlds in one. You have the developed part of the country that's comparable to what you'd find in the most developed country in the world, with obviously people who have got access to that part of the world really can access the services, the facilities that are comparable to the best that you would get anywhere else in the developed world. And there's another side to it, which is basically comparable to the poorest parts of the continent, African continent, that you can ever get. And so the two coexist in a very very tricky, and as you can imagine, that's in a sense can be a major source of social instability. There is high levels of poverty linked with very high levels of unemployment, and part of the reasons for the high unemployment is that as a matter of policy in the past before our democratic transition, basically there was a conscious effort not to skill the African labor force. Now, in an economy where close to about 2/3 to 70% of our GDP is in services, so you've got both individuals who are not employed but essentially unemployable. And that is another source of instability. The public face of poverty is, of course, African and women, and that feeds into some of these divides. So from a public policy point of view, I mean, that's the mix that you have. Now, we started well post-1994 during the time of President Mandela and the early stages of President Mbeki, and I think, but for about 8 years, the past 8 years or so, we significantly misstepped. And essentially, I think our country fell into the trap of the very toxic alliance between corrupt politicians and basically, I guess, the criminal part in business, and that has pulled the country back. And over the past 18 months, we are trying to re-emerge from that. Now, the reason that's important is that during that period in particular, that has fed to the worst possible stereotypes of Afro-pessimists about the nature of African leadership. And so a lot of people, some people, not a lot, some people in South Africa were struggling to come to terms with the transition from a racial past. Always believed that the first years of Mandela and President Mbeki were just too good to be true, that these Africans indeed will pretty soon show their true colors. And I think over the past 8 years, and that fed into the worst possible stereotypes. The consequence of that is that we then had re-emergence of racism in our society. And so that is where we are. So that background is also relevant why I say to my friend that it's good that South Africa won the World Cup today, because if you understand that dynamic and you understand the symbolism of fielding probably the most diverse team that we've ever fielded in the history of South Africa, led for the first time by an African captain. So in fact the country, and at a time when South Africa has been looking for some good stories, and I think this is one of those, we believe probably one of the turning points. Over the past 2 years, there's a lot that's being done to try and correct the issues that I've raised. Now, that's the context of the country, and as I get to my understanding of the topic that I'm dealing with, if you could just have that sort of backdrop. There's no question that digital healthcare and innovation, one is reinventing the way medicine is practiced. It makes diagnosis faster. It empowers patients to leverage, at least empowers those patients who leverage this technology to take greater responsibility for their health. Now, people are already wearing devices to monitor their activity and checking basically on an hourly basis their exercise, their sleeping pattern. That devices these days you can swallow, that monitor your gut biome, your stress levels, your insulin levels, and transmit this to doctors who can make early diagnosis of potential health risks. Now, for those who are beneficiaries of that, you can't say anything negative about these technologies, because actually people are deriving benefit from that. Now, as Jomo indicated, my career straddled between the public sector for about 16 years, from 1994 at the time of our transition until 2011. And one of a friend that we share with Shamila, called Dai McIntyre, says now I've joined the dark side. So I've been working with a private entity now for the past 6 years, and perhaps the company is called Discovery, and it's a company that actually embraces technology and uses particularly its wellness program Vitality, and uses member data to advance a new approach to the way we are. It's the biggest health insurer in South Africa currently. It's spread to China, to the UK, to Singapore, to Australia, and Hong Kong, Malaysia, Thailand. That's where we are. And largely, a lot of this is about really the use of the power of data analytics, as well as also the issue of the wellness program. There is, for those who might have interest, there is a case study that is used at Harvard on the shared value model, and basically Discovery is the subject of that. This is a case study written by Michael Porter. Now, yesterday we spoke a lot about the transition that some of these big tech giants, Google and Amazon, have undergone over the past few years. Google just hardly 10 years ago was just a search engine. Amazon just an online bookstore. Now these companies are at the forefront of the revolution in digital healthcare, with data-rich innovations that enable doctors to discover patterns and causes of diseases. The other thing that I think we should all acknowledge is that artificial intelligence, the AI engines, are playing a key role in moderating the information asymmetry, which of course is one of the key elements that characterizes market failure in the health sector. And we've seen the evolution basically around on digital technology and the application in health. And I think this is a trend, and as has been indicated by my colleagues, is that because health is such a growing sector, because there's so much money that's in the health sector, it's logical that it's going to be an area that is going to be aggressively pursued by the private sector. And technology seems to be a significant entry point. So it does seem to me that technology is here to stay, and that the question that we should really be asking, and I think we began to grapple with this issue yesterday, is around defining the parameters of how it is funded to ensure that it tilts in the direction of promoting greater equity and inclusion. And I think that is the biggest challenge, because at this point in time, I think most of these technologies are widening the divide between those who can access them and the have-nots. Now, in South Africa, for example, we've got about 18 to 20% of the population that's covered by health insurance. Now, this is the 18 to 20% private health insurance that accesses healthcare comparable to any in the world. And most of these, and the company that I work for insures probably 60% of this 18 to 20%. The 80% that depends on the state is being left behind to a significant extent. But I can tell you that, to me, the more worrying issue is that, at least in the South African context, most of our academic institutions, in fact, virtually all our academic institutions in the health space, are, oh, sorry, I think. Yesterday, somebody was talking about people having 5 phones. So the point I was trying to make is that about most of our training in the health sector, in the health services in South Africa, takes place within the public sector platform, which means, therefore, it's on a platform that's limited in terms of exposure to these technologies. First of all, this has got implications for the next generation of health professionals that we produce. But actually, the unintended consequence of that is the temptation for doctors, particularly specialists, to want to migrate because they want to be exposed to these technologies, to service the 18 to 20% of the population that is in the private sector. And this then exacerbates already a dire situation in terms of maldistribution of resources. And just remember that professional workforce is very mobile, and it's only rational for individuals, especially because they are mobile, globally mobile, that they would want to put themselves in a situation where it would be easier for them to move right across all over the globe. And so you have that. Now, you can then argue that the existence of that private health sector in South Africa has been a negative thing. But unfortunately, it's not that simple because South Africa, precisely because I've told you about the structure of the economy and the high levels of unemployment, South Africa invests a lot on attracting tourism, on boosting out tourism. And a viable health sector is very important to underpin that tourism. And tourists don't care whether it's a public or private. What they want essentially is to be in a place where they would get the assistance if they need it. And so the private health sector has played a key role. Secondly, I've told you about previous policies that basically undermine the skilling of certain sections of the population. And therefore, to attract investment, South Africa also has to attract skilled labor forces. For example, if Mercedes-Benz wants to put a plant in South Africa, which they have done, they have to bring a significant pool of technicians at the beginning to train South Africans. On the positive side is that over time, it becomes possible to demonstrate that the same people can be trained and produce highly technical products that can compete anywhere in the world. But at the beginning, you need that. And during my time in the foreign ministry, I actually had to deal always when we're attracting investment with these questions about how your health system is. If we bring these technicians, what access do they have to really basically to what is comparable to what they would have, let's call it in Germany. And so these issues are not easy. So the point I'm really trying to belabor here is that yesterday we spoke a bit, and I was talking to Sakika about this, that all of us instinctively would want to see a bigger role for governments. And in fact, we would actually want to see greater accountability for governments to the extent that governments might be making investments in the research institutions, that the benefits of that don't flow into private hands without benefit that goes to the rest of the population. But yesterday we made the point that we don't want these governments to only be users, regulators, but we want them to really be involved and to have a significant stake in the development and the financing of the technology in the country. But what then is the reality is that yesterday I know that my colleague from France disputed the issue about the hollowing of the state using the example of the European Union. But the reality is that most of the developing world is that the state has been hollowed. That secondly, the reality is that in most of the developing world, those who are in political office are preoccupied with the problems of today. Actually solving the problems of today that makes them electable 5 years down the line. And so it requires a lot of forward-looking leaders for us to begin to reorientate the state within the context of those limited resources to deal with the sort of issues that we're talking about. Now, it's not an impossible task. I'm just trying to point out that it is, and it seems to me that any approach to this issue that looks at the private sector and the public sector and essentially say the private sector is moving ahead with all the problems that I think we've correctly diagnosed and pointed out. And then we say the counter to that simply must be that the state must take a greater role. I think in the context of a developing country, I think we're just setting ourselves for failure because the one is not going to move and the one is going to move at a faster pace. And I think that raises the issue about whether we can conceive of some form of partnerships between the public and the private sector. And also it raises the issue whether in fact we can get, especially in the development and use and testing and making these technologies far much more appropriate for wider use, what is the role then of academic institutions, research institutions, NGOs, philanthropic organizations? Now, and again, I was making the point to Francis just now that when you talk about the academic institutions, I happen also also carry a hat of chairing a council of a university, my alma mater in South Africa. And I know exactly what difficulties that we have in terms of sustaining academic programs and research programs using the first and the second streams of funding. And all of us are trying to encourage the same institutions actually to aggressively pursue third stream funding, which basically comes from the same private sector. So it is a very complex issue. I'm not putting it as something that cannot be done, but I'm simply pointing out that it actually requires a far much more nuanced approach for us to see how we can pool resources, establish linkages across these academic research institutions between the institutions in the north and the south so that we can maximize our impact, but also more importantly to begin to understand that it seems to me that there is no shortcut to stepping back and thinking far much more creatively about how we can try to establish the sort of partnerships between the public and the private sector that allows a bit of re-engineering of some of the benefit that accrues. But having said that, PPPs are not easy. The last point I would really like to make is that in South Africa, we have seen in the context of in terms of the digital welfare state, whatever attempts we are trying to do on that. Classical example, South Africa runs one of the most expansive, because of the levels of poverty, a grant system, social security system in the developing world. And we have a company, it's actually in the article that the special rapporteur was referring to yesterday. It's a Net One subsidiary. It's called Cape Cash Paymaster Services. And it has been involved in grant disbursement through biometric identification. There's a very elaborate system. On the surface, played a very good role in terms of making sure that beneficiaries get their benefits on time and things like those. But actually, on the negative side, I've pointed to some problems about corruption and linkages between some of the private entities, and it's been caught up in exactly the same issue. So these are very difficult. However, I think maybe the last point I want to make is that it's important that we have discussions like this, because I think we keep on searching for these answers, which are actually not easy, and they require far much deeper concentration of minds, concentration of effort, but also just understand that, and that's the last point really I want to make, that even in certainly my experience in South Africa is that we started well. We probably fought some of the battles that Jomo was referring to on the pharmaceutical side, but leadership in these countries does matter, and because institutions are not too strong, so individuals do matter who are in leadership positions, and it takes a small thing to shift things completely to move in the negative direction. And the consequences of that, unfortunately, it completely slows down the agenda for social inclusion and advancing equity. And that has been the painful lesson in South Africa. But those are really the comments I wanted to make. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those remarks, particularly the reminder of what this conference is really about. the inequalities not only at the national level but also at the international level, and how technical innovation in this particular session about the financing of technological transformations can affect the progress in whatever direction. Before going any further, I have to mention that because we have one speaker less for this session, I was asked to close this session early in order to have more time. But I think it's really unfair because I think we've finally come back on course in some ways. So I need to get some guidance from you, Sakiko. So I'm putting the boom, and then perhaps we could have a shorter coffee break, and then come back for the last session, which will have an additional speaker, if I understand correctly, right? Yeah.
Or maybe we just don't have coffee break anymore. No. You have
Priorities.
Okay, so we have to have coffee break. So yes, why don't we go for another 15 minutes? Is that all right?
Okay.
Well, we also started late. Yeah. So why don't we go? Is it okay to go for another 15 minutes?
Why about 10 minutes? Because otherwise we won't have
I know, it's all very difficult. Yes. Okay. Well, until 10:40. Yeah.
No, we need to go longer. This is a really important session.
I think so.
We have to
Well,
go
the
longer.
next one is too. Well, we can stay here all hours.
They're all important.
Okay. Yes, I think we've just heard our three speakers. I consider Ayanda also a speaker because of the significance of his remarks. I think the challenge in relation to Megan's argument is really what the equity aspects of the current kind of financing are, because in the larger scheme of things, how significant is the kind of financing which she's talking about, and how do we ensure that that kind of technological transformations are socially progressive? Susan talked more generally about financialization and its impact, and I think we have to really think about health-related technological innovations, and this is really where the challenge is. And Ayanda reminded us of the range of issues which we need to consider going forward. So, without further ado, yes, please. You have we have quite a number of people queuing up. So, I would like to invite interventions from the floor, and then we will have a round of responses, and then we'll close. Okay, please.
All right. So deep thanks to all of you for this panel. And Megan, I have to ask you two questions. One is, and please, they're meant much more gently than they will come across. So it's really out of genuine curiosity about how rock health is, what the logics are. And so my first question is more of a big picture question, and that is, you made a point of saying that you don't do bricks and mortar investment. And yet in poor communities, and in poor communities in the United States as well as poor communities around the world, bricks and mortars is actually where you need to start, because in order to put any of these technologies in place, you have to be able to plug into something. So there's a way in which these technologies get ahead of the game when there's nothing in place that actually is any kind of organization for this to be anything but a technological Wild West. So that's the first question. The second one has to do with the comment that you were making relative to the behavioral monitoring, where people would be able to listen for particular code words, and then it would be on a monitor. So there's a couple of things with this. I'm wondering if you're talking to social scientists who have actually critiqued how this actually works. Now, and I understand that the emphasis for you is on investor return, but in terms of, and this is really the divide that we're talking about here that is so crucial, is that there's investor return versus improved health outcomes. And the data show that when you've got monitors, as you do when we first started using electronic fetal monitoring, and nurses can simply sit at their station, In fact, maternal health care outcomes decline because people are just looking at a bank of monitors as opposed to being engaged, going into people's rooms and actually seeing how people are. And when I imagine what it will look like to have an algorithm picking out code words, I imagine two things happening. First, that kind of becoming a bit immune to what you're listening to, or when you're trying to monitor more case studies than you did before this technology. That is not likely to improve health outcomes. But the other thing that's going to happen is that the people that are being monitored will get savvy to the code words that will alert and signal to the caseworkers that are supposed to be monitoring and oftentimes surveilling them. They will become alert to the fact that they just don't use those words, and then the algorithm just becomes useless. And the catching up of these algorithms, because the feedback loop from the patients, it comes from the investors very quickly, but it doesn't come from the patients very quickly. And so these are two major issues. First, a big picture issue, and then on the ground when you're actually looking at health outcomes versus investor outcomes.
Thank you. Please.
I don't like to start the weekend with such a sense of despair, but this is the way the panel has left me. And I just, first of all, I just want to point out that we've really had a session on the new rules of the game in contemporary global capitalism. So on one level, we have a firm absolutely taking advantage of those new rules. On another level, deep analysis of how saturated, if you will, our world is with these new rules. And then, in a sense, that there's no way of sidestepping the rules, and we need to find tiny little spaces in which progressive approaches can survive and make a difference. And without jumping the gun on the next session around solidarity, and perhaps asking our first speaker to, as I really want a response from all speakers in terms of how do we change the rules of the game. So I understand that this, for the first speaker, is counter to the aims of your firm and approach, but what would constitute changing the rules of the game in favor of equity and social justice?
Thank you all for a very interesting discussion this morning. I guess I want to ask about and maybe challenge some of the assumptions of the discussion, where so much of this conference has been focused on new technologies, artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, et cetera. But from a financing standpoint, I'm curious from every member of the panel, is how can we think about financing the already existing technologies that we know are proven to work, and some of the technologies that are very low cost. When we think about, particularly a lot of new technologies are focused on hyper-vertical interventions for diabetes over here, this disease over here. How do we reduce the time on response on this one particular issue, when we know that improving overall access to basic nutrition, particularly for new mothers, already is proven to work, and from a preventative care standpoint. And I'm curious about how can we increase financing, particularly in a developing country context, for, again, existing technologies, not a better new vaccine, but just expanding access to vaccines that we know have been proven to work, we know have been proven for 100 years. Not a new polio vaccine, but improved access to improved water and sanitation. How do we think about greater funding to enable greater access from a health outcomes perspective to address existing inequities that we know how to solve? It's just we haven't had the political will and the financial will to solve. Thank you.
Please.
Yeah, thank you for the wonderful discussion. So my question is based on Schumpeterian and neo-Schumpeterian ideas of macroeconomics and at the farm level, based on the routine. So this first question is for Megan. So as part of this firm, I mean, I don't know how big it is, your firm, but when you showed the examples of certain areas of those apps, so I just want to ask that how do you, or how does the firm or the group who runs the firm internalizes the decisions and choices on directing certain invention and innovation. So routines with something which like defines the choices and decisions you make on everyday basis of running the firm. And my second question is to Susan, that in this global digital health capitalism, like that was highlighted in Mary's presentation yesterday, that how do you see the influence of market structure in terms of merger and acquisition? Because these global MNCs have acquired enormous IPR and resources with mergers and acquisition. So how do you see firms like maybe Rock Health or others being acquired, and that creates a legitimizing factor for the big MNC to get more confidence from investors in terms of having the resource of a firm which is already doing that work on health domain? Yeah, thank you.
Can you hear me? So my question's for you, Megan, and I'm feeling like you might feel like you walked into the lion's den here a little bit. So I want to say how valuable it was to hear from you and to really get an inside view of how people, particularly in Silicon Valley, are thinking about these investments. And so my question is pretty simple, but it has to do with the kind of Medicare for All plans that are currently on the political table in the U.S. and whether your company takes a position on those and what it might be. And should those, I mean, I don't want to get hopeful here, but like should those plans move closer to reality, where do you see the future for investment within a sort of changed healthcare context in the U.S.?
Please.
Thanks. I have two questions from both Megan and Ayanda. So on the slide that showed the top 6 value propositions or something, I'm familiar with some of the companies, and I think the question for me, similar to the speaker, the one that was just here, is to understand what percentage of the market, maybe not market, but when you look at those 6 innovative solutions or the companies there, what percentage of the population are those products going to service? So Ayanda speaks about the 20%, 80% divide in South Africa. Do you have an idea what that looks like for the solutions you invested? And then secondly, do you know of venture capital or similar companies investing in developing settings where the market might not be as lucrative, the interest to invest might not be quite the same as it is in the US? And then, Ayanda, a few questions for you. I think the first is, in what would your idea of innovative ways that governments, the state can finance innovations for the 80%? Since you've been in public service and now have this role, what are your reflections on that? The other is the role that you see for companies, the private sector. Should there be a role, should there be a responsibility, should there be an obligation on the private sector to innovate for the 80%? Whether it's as a corporate social responsibility or whatever, but is that some way that the state could get into that place somehow, and what do you think that would look like? And finally, I mean, I've just been reflecting on the role of citizens in this debate, because oftentimes we talk about the consumer, we talk about the patient, but in looking at how the lessons around community mobilizations and how citizens can have a voice in demanding better access, innovation for things that matter. One last question on Africa. Everybody keeps talking about the questions of unemployment, the youth bulge, and I'm wondering whether there's an opportunity that might be missed to develop a different set of innovators, create interest in that youth market, which may not be employed or unemployable, towards innovation, but innovation that is relevant to their context.
Thank you. Last 2 questions from here.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you so much for this incredibly rich panel. I keep on thinking about, the next steps and where we're going in terms of lessons from the 20th century. I mean, in 2001, we did the Human Development Report on technologies, technologies for human development. And I think the lessons of the 20th century for answering that question that Ayanda put so succinctly and clearly, how do you define the parameters to tilt the pattern of investment to serve the poor and the excluded. And I mean, in a sense, my own understanding of those lessons is that yes, public sector investment in things like ORD, oral rehydration therapy, was tremendously important. Who financed it? It was the public sector. It was philanthropies, government, and so forth, right? It's not based on private investment incentives. And number two, there was no intellectual property protection that was very stringently, dramatically interfering, if you like, with some of these access issues. That the way, it's not whether you have intellectual property or not at all. It's about how intellectual property is designed and what is patentable and so forth. So, there were some game changers between the 20th century and the 21st century, and Susan talked about that in terms of reports about intellectual property and financialization, the structural changes. But if we try to get back to the question of health, we do know that in the area, for example, of pharmaceuticals, that there is a big issue of changing the rules of intellectual property so that it is more amenable to bridging those divides. And so my question is that in this context of 21st century, what are the rules that need to be changed? I mean, I have not seen any. There are plenty of studies that show the effect of the current intellectual property regime on access to medicines. Do we have that kind of analysis for the investment priorities in the private sectors in terms of who it's for and who it's benefiting and what is motivating it? I mean, we heard from Philip Alston that in the area of social services, it was essentially for cost cutting for the provider. It was not for improving services for the recipient. And those, I think, are the questions that need to be asked. And so, I'd sort of like to have some insights of where we put together, bridge the connect, Megan's presentation and Susan's presentation and Ayanda's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Sridhar, last word.
So I'll make it quick. So thank you very much for this. I learned quite a lot. So my question starts from the position of this, which is that a lot of the focus has been on innovation in healthcare, which is sort of the early diagnosis of disease and illness and the management and care. What I'm concerned about is that the way you change population health is you actually affect the determinants of disease and illness. And one of the interesting things is that I was in a meeting, a couple of days meetings with Americans and British people who are working on this problem that both countries are spending too much on health care, but we need to think about how do you make people healthier. And the one thing that the Americans had in common is that they started from the assumption that in order to change population health, you have to figure out a way to make money from that. Otherwise, you're not going to incentivize big actors into doing something like that. So my one question, both for the U.S., for the investor is, have you seen any startups that are actually not working on disease management, but on the determinants of illness, and what sort of thing, and what do you think about this problem of like, if you don't make money from preventing disease, then how are we going to make population health? And in South Africa, it's the same thing that's happening, is that the focus on health is going on how do we pay for access to health care, but where are the resources and the people that are actually thinking about how do you change the institutions and the conditions that determine disease and ill health?
Thank you. Now, we've had a very, very interesting range of questions. I don't think we're going to be able to answer everything in the minutes which we have, but I would encourage, many of the questions also deal with the larger questions of governance, which is the subject of the next discussion. So in many ways, this flows very nicely into the next discussion. But feel free to answer what you would like to answer. Don't bother what asked. Please.
Yeah, thank you all so much for the great questions. And I guess if I don't get to all of them, you can hold me accountable and come find me over coffee. So I jotted down some notes. So the question on moving upstream away from just healthcare interventions, and am I seeing companies that are addressing kind of more the social determinants of health? Yes. Like, I cannot tell you how much more I see of those companies and how much more social determinants of health are part of the conversation among, like, not just the venture community, but also among the health systems, the health plans that we look to in terms of the interventions that they're going to want to fund. So a really explicit example is a company called Unitas. There's a similar company to them called NowPow, and they essentially work with health systems to make sure that they can help patients plug into local community resources. So Kaiser Permanente, I think they're starting this in the California market, but they just announced a really big partnership with Unitas, and essentially Unitas kind of convenes the community resources, whether that's around housing, transportation, food, etc., and make sure that all of those resources are kind of centralized into essentially a database that integrates with the electronic health record at Kaiser, so that when they have patients that could benefit from some of those resources, it's just really easy to be able to identify those resources and connect the patient into them and make those referrals. And so when we think about a Kaiser Permanente, which is an integrated delivery network and really kind of is managing the risk, managing all the outcomes and financial risk of a given population, they're really excited about those sorts of solutions, as well as the health plans that kind of similarly have accountability for the population health outcomes. I mean, you also see, I think there's a reason why Uber and Lyft are actually moving into healthcare, because they see a huge opportunity to support people that otherwise wouldn't necessarily have rides to go to the doctor. And so you see them having similar partnerships with health systems, health plans, to make sure that folks are making it to their appointments on time. So yes, absolutely, a lot of activity in that space. There was a question about kind of policy and how does policy influence kind of the investment decisions that we're making. And I think what's interesting is that regardless of the party that's been in power, there has been this steady shift towards value-based care, so paying based on outcomes as opposed to fee-for-service. And that's, I think, where we really hinge our investment thesis, is that we don't just want to, and we won't, invest in solutions that we see that are kind of advocating the status quo. And kind of, to give a concrete example, there are some new reimbursement codes around remote monitoring. And so if you're a physician, you can actually, be paid for monitoring your patients and then intervening with them in a remote way. We see some solutions that are set up to help physicians take advantage of those reimbursement codes, but don't necessarily have a focus, to somebody's point, on validating that those solutions are actually turning the dial on those patient outcomes. We don't invest in those companies. I mean, we invested, and I think Marigold came up in one of the questions, we invested in Marigold, which is the solution for folks with substance use disorder, because they're actually working with those inpatient rehab facilities to prove out that when they have people using their application, they are seeing kind of reduced rates of relapse. And so being able to understand the company's validation pathway and moving towards outcomes is critically important to any investment that we're going to make. And thinking about fee-for-service versus outcomes-based care, kind of the purpose of Marigold, again, is to not just keep those people sober, but it's also to kind of reduce the overall cost of the system. And so I think incentives are really aligned there when you think about population health management. And I can address some of the questions that there were around kind of the monitoring that goes on. So it it isn't kind of shown up on a monitor for the care managers. The patients have already been discharged from the hospital, and so they're using an app that puts them into an anonymous chat group. There is a machine learning algorithm that does look at the sentiment of those conversations. Those machine learning algorithms are continuously learning, and so even if the type of conversation evolves over time, the machine learning algorithm will evolve with it as well. But the whole purpose is to figure out where are the spikes in mental health issues or spikes in stress, whatever it is that's going to require that patient have more of an intervention with the care manager. And so the intention is that person, that care manager, is going to be able to intervene at exactly the right time when that person most needs it. And it isn't, I guess, in my mind, it is a new type of solution, because beforehand these care managers really didn't have a great opportunity to connect with those patients that have already been discharged. Those patients are kind of on their own, they're back in their communities, and they may be around those things that are very triggering to them, that may have contributed to the addiction in the first place. And so to us, this was a way to extend the care manager's relationship with those patients to make sure that there is support that is ongoing after the discharge. There was also, and I guess speaking to also the point of, going back to the point of like, how does policy influence our investment? So I think that we less so swing with kind of the political tides, and we're very much more focused on that shift to value-based care. Another example of that is one of our investments is in a digital solution to manage diabetes. It's called Virta, and so they do a lot of remote coaching. They do, they do kind of monitoring of blood sugar levels, et cetera. And one thing that they do is when they contract with health plans or employers, they aren't just saying, hey, pay for this for your patients. It's going to be, a kind of per use model. What they say is, we're actually going to only have you pay us if it works. So in the first year, we're just looking at engagement, because that's what we're going to see. So if folks are actually engaging with the solution, then you're going to pay us for it. But after year 2, we want to see A1C levels drop among the population that is using this solution. And you're only going to need to pay us for that solution if we can prove the endpoints that you're really interested in seeing among your population. And so we get really excited about that, because I think the government has been admittedly slower to shift in terms of these value-based care contracts, and we actually see some of that innovation coming from the types of companies that we're investing in, which is really exciting. There was a question about investing in bricks and mortar, and admittedly, we are a U.S. focused investment firm, and so actually, when I think about kind of capital going towards bricks and mortar, I don't think that's necessarily where we see the most need. So there's actually a ton of, if the goal is to move care to lower cost care settings, I think there's actually less of a need for capital investment in things like hospitals. I actually expect that if we do our job well, there's going to be a lot of empty hospital beds. Right now there's not, because the system is set up in a fee-for-service way, and so hospitals make money when they're at capacity. And so I think that if we believe that that these kind of telemedicine models, remote care management models, making sure that we're intervening with patients earlier, there's actually going to be less of a need for that capital intensive kind of hospital infrastructure that we've already seen a lot of. That said, there are a lot of investors that do invest in bricks and mortar healthcare solutions. Our focus has very much been on how can we leverage software to improve healthcare and improve the health system. But I'm sure I missed a bunch of things, but happy to chat more later.
Thank you, Megan.
I'll just say a couple words. Antitrust, aggressive enforcement of antitrust policies would help, I think. Also, regulating finance, again, going back to boring banking, where we didn't have all these financial crises. Because it's pretty obvious when we moved to roaring banking, when we dismantled the when we dismantled the wall between investment and retail banking, things got wild, and we can close that that box again. And then I've read an interesting proposal about IP by this guy in Canada who does really interesting work, and he's saying that now the U.S. and China IP competition is similar to the nuclear competition between the Soviet Union and the United States. And what we really need is a strategic arms limitation treaty, because we're both hurting each other and choking innovation by aggressively patenting more and more. I think it's a really interesting idea. I don't think China would be anywhere near ready for that, but we're feeling the pain more than they are at this point. But at some point, it's going to he argues that it's going to just be like mutually assured destruction, and we should have some kind of an arms race treaty around that. So that's all I'm saying.
Thank you, Susan.
I mean, just 2 comments. I mean, the one point is really that there is research, obviously research that takes place in most of the even within the developing world, that's sponsored by governments. But I think one of the shortcomings is that a lot of this research, once it gets to the stage of commercialization, it's parceled off. And then I don't think there's enough accountability for that, and I think this is something that actually needs to be raised much more strongly. The second comment I would like to make is that, I mean, the debate, once we've accepted, as we have in the course of this discussion, that these technologies are not neutral and all the statements that we've made, then it elevates the debate to a higher order problem in the sense that it's closely linked to generally the crisis in terms of the politics, generally the type of political order that we have. And this is an inescapable thing. And everything else that we discuss it with is going to lead us to confronting that reality, that the type of a far much more accommodating, inclusive, even capitalism that is far much more understand some of the threats that are posed by the current levels of basically significant exclusion, that it's actually not sustainable. But that's a higher order issue. But if you really were to look at everything else that we're discussing, it takes you unavoidably to that conclusion, and something that we'll have to deal with. The other thing that to me is a major source of misgivings is far much more even with the research, and this is far much more clearer in the case of the pharmaceuticals, is that there's so much work that is done in the developing world in the form of clinical trials and all sorts of things. But there is no correlation between all that work and the value that those who participate in those trials give to them benefiting from the products of essentially what was there. And I think, again, these are things that need to be raised. The challenge that we have is that, certainly talking for some of the countries in the South, is that with the exception of a few countries that probably have got the voice, there comes to be so much pressure on some of these governments, and in fact the government starts working against the best interests of their citizens. And that is the issue that we'll have to. And the last point that I would really talk about is that one of the things that we can never underestimate in this context, and again drawing on the South African experience, it is not possible, it would not have been possible for South Africa at the time we had these major discussions around the pharmaceuticals and the conflict that we have. I mean, we had 3 things that actually enabled South Africa to succeed. The first one was, obviously, it was just a lucky period in the history of South Africa, because we had a Mandela who had a certain image, and therefore it was very different. The second thing, quite frankly, is because we had in the United States Bill Clinton. And Bill Clinton took a strategic position even at a time when his trade representative wanted to put South Africa on Watch 201. That actually it would not be the correct thing to do. And the third issue, which to me was very, very powerful, was the sort of support that we got from significant people that we actually didn't know about, people who had actually fought the struggles in the developed North. We didn't know about them, because we woke up one day in South Africa and realized that every patent lawyer had been put on a retainer by the pharmaceutical industry. And so the people, just don't want to mention the name, but I got a call from somebody who was based in the US, who had been part of the Canada, European Union battles, and who knew a lot of things about it. And we got a number of activists from across the globe who were prepared to fly to South Africa to give us the technical support, because we actually did not understand We knew what we wanted, but some of the technical detail about all these agreements that have been signed, and these were independent. So nothing would also replace the solidarity between people who are concerned about these issues between the North and the South, and certainly talking from the position of the countries of the South, where sometimes standing alone are extremely vulnerable. I think those linkages, those alliances, whether it's NGOs or government institutions, or in fora like this for us to exchange ideas, those are very extremely important. That's the response.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking the panelists.